Chapter 1: The Long View. The ride ended where the world did. A forest green Ford F-250, its suspension groaning with every lurch, clawed its way up the last 100 yards of what barely qualified as a road. Rocks, the size of fists and skulls, jutted from the packed dirt. Deep ruts from spring thaws carved a treacherous path through the dense pine. Julian Hale sat in the passenger seat, his right hand braced against the dashboard, his knuckles white. He watched the trees blur into a solid wall of green and brown. The air, thin and sharp, smelled of pine resin and cold stone. The driver, a man named Henderson with a face like worn leather and a jaw packed with chewing tobacco, did not speak. He had said maybe 50 words during the entire 2-hour ascent from the ranger station. His focus was absolute, his hands steering the heavy truck with an economy of motion born from 1,000 identical trips. The cab of the truck was a small, noisy world of its own, filled with the roar of the engine, the squeal of the chassis, and the constant crackle of a radio which had long since given up trying to find a signal. Finally, Henderson wrestled the wheel one last time. The truck crested the final rise and rolled to a stop in a small, circular clearing. The engine sputtered off, and a silence so profound it felt like a pressure change rushed in to fill the void. Julian's ears popped. For a moment, neither man moved. "This is it," Henderson grunted. He spat a stream of brown juice out his open window. "Sutter's Peak, top of the world." Julian opened his door and stepped out. The ground was uneven, a carpet of pine needles and loose shale. He stretched, his spine cracking in protest after the jarring ride. He took a deep breath. The air up here was different. It was clean, pure, with a crystalline edge which seemed to scrape the lungs. He tilted his head up. Above the clearing, piercing the deep blue of the high-altitude sky, was the tower. It was a stark, skeletal thing. 4 immense steel legs, cross-braced with a spiderweb of girders, rose 100 feet from a concrete base. At the very top, a small square room sat enclosed in glass, a lonely observation post against the immensity of the sky. A single, brutally steep staircase zigzagged up one of the legs, each step a perforated metal plank. It looked less like a building and more like a piece of industrial equipment abandoned in the wilderness. "Home sweet home," Henderson said, his voice flat. He had gotten out and was already unstrapping Julian's gear from the truck bed. A large duffel bag, a heavy-duty cooler, a box of books, and a long, padded case containing Julian's personal telescope. Julian walked to the edge of the clearing. The view was staggering. A sea of green, an endless expanse of rolling hills and deep valleys covered in a thick, unbroken canopy of trees stretched to every horizon. He could see for 100 miles in every direction. There were no towns, no roads, no smoke, no sign of human existence beyond the small clearing and the metal sentinel standing in its center. He had wanted isolation. He had found it. The sheer scale of it was humbling, bordering on oppressive. Radio check is at 0800 and 1900. Every day. You miss one, we wait for the next. You miss two, we send a team up. A team coming up here is expensive. Don't miss your check-ins. Henderson dropped the last of the bags onto the ground with a thud. "Water pump is over there." He pointed a thick finger toward a manual hand pump set over a wellhead a few yards away. "Generator in the shed at the base. Only use it if you have to. Fuel is limited. Your main job is watching. You see smoke, you use the radio. Simple. Julian nodded, his throat dry. Understood. Henderson stared at him for a long moment, his eyes squinting against the sun. You a talker, Hale? Not especially, Julian replied. Good. Henderson gave a curt nod as if Julian had passed a final, unspoken test. Corvin, the fella before you, he was a talker, talked to himself a lot near the end. He offered no further explanation. He climbed back into the truck, the springs groaning in protest. See you in 3 months. The engine turned over, coughed a plume of black smoke, and roared to life. Henderson executed a tight 3-point turn, and the truck rumbled away, descending the path they had just climbed. Julian stood and watched until the green vehicle was swallowed by the trees. The sound of its engine faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind moving through the high branches. He was alone, completely. The realization settled not with fear but with a strange, quiet sense of relief. No more disappointed looks from his thesis advisor. No more crowded city streets. No more pressure. Just him, the sky, and a million acres of trees. He shouldered his duffel bag and carried his boxes to the base of the tower. He left the telescope case for last, handling it with a reverence he usually reserved for rare manuscripts. The ascent was grueling. His leg muscles burned with the effort of climbing the steep, narrow stairs. The wind picked up as he climbed higher, a steady, insistent force that pushed against him and whistled through the steel latticework. He did not look down. The room at the top was a single square, perhaps 15 feet by 15 feet. Glass windows wrapped around all 4 sides, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the world. A narrow metal catwalk encircled the exterior. Inside, the furnishings were Spartan. A single cot was pushed against the solid back wall. A small table with 2 chairs sat in the middle of the room. A bank of radio equipment rested on a built-in wooden desk. And in the very center, mounted on a pedestal, was the Osborne fire finder. It was a beautiful, antique piece of brass and steel, a circular map of the region under a rotating sight. Julian ran his fingers over its cool surface. This would be his primary tool, his companion. He spent the next hour unpacking. He put his clothes in a small footlocker, arranged his non-perishable food items in a small cabinet, and stacked his books on the floor next to the cot. He set up his star charts and notebooks on one side of the small table, creating a workspace. The place began to feel less like a sterile observation post and more like his own small, strange home. In the bottom of the cabinet, beneath a stack of old, water-stained topographical maps, he found the journal. It was a thick, black ledger, the kind accountants used a century ago. Its cover was worn smooth at the edges. He opened it. The first page read in neat, disciplined cursive: Sutter's Peak Lookout, Post Log, Samuel Corvin. Julian sat at the table and flipped through the first few pages. Corvin's entries were meticulous. May 12. Arrived 14:30. Henderson dropped off supplies. Weather clear, wind from the northwest at 5 knots. Haziness on the western horizon, likely coastal fog. Observed a flock of migrating geese, approximately 200 individuals heading north. May 13. First full day. Radio check at 0800 with Garvey. All clear. Spent the morning calibrating the fire finder. Afternoon spent observing cloud patterns. Cirrus clouds developing from the west, indicating a possible weather front in the next 48 hours. Saw a black bear with 2 cubs near the spring line on Mount Jefferson, 5 miles east. The entries were all like this: calm, scientific, observational. Julian felt a sense of connection to this unknown man. They were 2 of a kind, men who sought refuge in observation and data. He closed the journal and placed it on the desk next to the radio. He would read more later. The afternoon bled into evening. Julian cooked a simple meal of canned chili on a small propane stove. He sat at the table and ate, watching the sun dip below the distant western peaks. The sunset from this vantage point was a religious experience. The sky exploded in waves of orange, pink, and deep violet. The shadows in the valleys below deepened, a slow tide of darkness rising to meet the fading light. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared, the temperature plummeted. The world outside the glass box turned from a detailed landscape into a vast, featureless blackness. There were no city lights to pollute the sky. The darkness was absolute, a perfect canvas. And then the stars appeared. Not all at once, but in a slow, magnificent procession. First Venus, a brilliant diamond in the west. Then the brighter ones, Sirius, Vega, Arcturus. Soon the sky was so crowded with points of light it seemed impossible. The Milky Way was a thick, luminous river, a trail of cosmic dust splashed across the heavens. Julian's breath caught in his chest. This was why he had come. This was the view he had dreamed of, a sky untouched by the modern world. He unlatched the trapdoor in the floor, which opened onto the catwalk. The wind was a cold, physical blow. He carefully maneuvered the padded case up through the opening and set it down. He assembled his telescope with practiced ease, his fingers finding the familiar screws and knobs in the dim starlight. It was a high-powered Dobsonian reflector, his most prized possession, the one thing he had saved from the fire sale of his old life. He aimed it first at Jupiter, easily resolving the gas giant's faint bands and the 4 tiny pinpricks of its Galilean moons. He smiled. The seeing up here was incredible. The thin, stable air offered a clarity he had only ever experienced at professional observatories. For the next few hours he was lost. He toured the familiar celestial landmarks of the northern hemisphere. He observed the ring nebula in Lyra, a perfect, ghostly smoke ring. He resolved the dense star cluster of M13 in Hercules, a glittering ball of 100,000 suns. This was his sanctuary. The universe was vast, ordered, and understandable. Its laws were predictable. Its movements were as comforting as a hymn. It was nearly midnight when he decided to check his alignment on Polaris, the North Star, the most constant point in the sky. He swung the heavy telescope around, centered the crosshairs, and leaned into the eyepiece. He frowned. He adjusted the focus knob. The star sharpened into a crisp point of light. But something was wrong. He leaned away from the eyepiece and blinked, rubbing his eyes. He must be tired. The long drive, the climb, the altitude. He looked again. It was still there. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail, but one which to his trained eye screamed like a fire alarm. Polaris was not a single star. It was a multiple-star system. Polaris A, the supergiant primary, was orbited by a tiny, faint companion, Polaris Ob. A larger star, Polaris B, orbited the pair at a great distance. With a good telescope, you could sometimes resolve Polaris B, resolving Polaris Ob from the overwhelming glare of the primary was almost impossible with amateur equipment. Almost. Julian had spent 100 nights in his college observatory trying. He knew the exact position, the precise angle where Polaris B should be. It was not in the right place. The discrepancy was minuscule, a fraction of an arcsecond, a measurement so small it was meaningless to anyone but an astronomer, but it was there. The star was just slightly off. Its position was wrong. He felt a sudden, cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was impossible. He stood up and paced the narrow catwalk, the wind whipping at his jacket. His mind raced, cataloging the rational explanations. Atmospheric lensing. A temperature inversion in the upper atmosphere could be bending the starlight. Plausible. He would check again in an hour. A flaw in the telescope's optics. A tiny imperfection in the primary mirror or a slight misalignment of the secondary. Possible. He had transported it up a rough road. He would need to recollimate it in the morning. Or he was simply tired. His eyes were playing tricks on him. This was the most likely explanation. He was exhausted. He was seeing things. He forced himself to take a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He was being ridiculous. He was a scientist. He dealt in data, not in panic speculation. He would take new measurements in the morning. He would recalibrate the mirrors. He would recheck his charts. There would be a simple, logical explanation. There always was. He disassembled the telescope, packed it carefully back into its case, and lowered it back into the room. He secured the trapdoor and stood for a long moment in the center of the glass box, staring out into the star-drenched darkness. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound that made the entire tower shudder almost imperceptibly. He tried to find Polaris with his naked eye. There it was, the steadfast anchor of the northern sky. It looked perfectly normal, unchanging, eternal. But he had seen what he had seen. He lay down on the cot, pulling a thick wool blanket over himself. He was bone-tired, but sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it. The tiny point of light, stubbornly residing where it had no right to be. A single, discordant note in the grand, cosmic symphony he had spent his entire life studying. He turned over, the cot groaning under his weight. The wind pressed against the glass, making a sound that was almost like a voice, whispering a language he did not understand. Outside, the sky was full of 1 billion stars, each moving in its precise, mathematical, predictable path, except for one. Chapter 2. A Flaw in the Canvas. A sliver of pale light under the door of the supply shed was the first thing Julian saw. He was lying on his back on the catwalk, the cold of the metal seeping through his jacket. He had no memory of falling asleep out here. He only remembered sitting with his back against the glass wall of the cab, watching the alien star patterns wheel across the sky, a feeling of cold, intellectual terror hollowing out his insides. His neck was a column of fire, and his muscles screamed in protest as he pushed himself into a sitting position. The sun was rising. The eastern sky was a soft, bruised purple, bleeding into a fiery orange along the horizon. The offending stars were gone, washed away by the familiar, comforting light of his own sun. In the clean, rational light of day, his nocturnal panic seemed absurd, a fever dream brought on by altitude and exhaustion. He stumbled back inside the cab, his body stiff and clumsy. He rubbed his face, the stubble rasping against his palms, atmospheric lensing. It had to be. A unique, localized temperature inversion creating a temporary distortion. It was a documented, if rare, phenomenon. As for Polaris B, his telescope's collimation was surely off after the truck ride. It was the only explanation that made any sense. The alternative was a violation of cosmic law, a complete breakdown of the predictable, clockwork universe he had dedicated his life to understanding. The alternative was madness. He spent the first hour of the morning in a ritual of pure, unadulterated science. He took the telescope apart on the catwalk, the morning air crisp and still. He meticulously checked the alignment of the primary and secondary mirrors, using a laser collimator to ensure they were perfectly centered. It was a delicate, precise operation, a form of meditation for him. Each turn of the screw was a reaffirmation of order, a small victory against the chaos of the previous night. He cleaned the eyepieces, polished the lenses, and reassembled the instrument with the focused calm of a surgeon. The machine was now perfect. Any error would not be its own. At precisely 0800, the radio crackled to life, startling him. A burst of static, then a woman's voice, clear and concise. "Sutter's Peak, this is dispatch. Do you copy? Over." Julian scrambled to the desk and picked up the handset. It felt heavy and substantial in his hand, a solid link to a world that still made sense. "Dispatch, this is Sutter's Peak. I copy. Over." "Copy that, Sutter's Peak. Weather is clear, no reported smoke. Wind is calm. Anything to report on your end? Over." The voice, belonging to Brenda Garvey, was devoid of warmth but professional. It was the voice of someone who had repeated these same lines thousands of times. "Nothing to report, dispatch. All clear on the peak. Over." He hesitated for a second, the words fighting in his throat. "The stars are wrong." He could imagine how that would sound. He could picture the note being made in a logbook. "New watcher is unstable." "Copy, all clear. Your next check-in is at 1900. Dispatch out." The radio fell silent. Julian replaced the handset, a wave of disappointment washing over him. He had wanted her to say more, to chat about the weather, to ask him how his first night was. He wanted a human connection, a tether to the reality he was starting to doubt. But Garvey was a professional, not a friend. He was a voice in a box on a mountain, nothing more. He spent the day doing the job he was hired for. He swept the floor of the cab, organized his supplies, and pumped a fresh bucket of water from the well. Every 30 minutes, he would perform a slow 360-degree scan of the horizon with a pair of high-powered binoculars. He saw nothing but trees. The sun climbed higher in the sky, a warm, benevolent presence. The world below was a masterpiece of natural beauty. He could see the sharp, granite spine of the mountain range to the east, the deep, shadow-choked valleys, the endless green of the forest. It was peaceful. It was real. The fears of the night felt a world away. In the afternoon, seeking a distraction, he picked up Samuel Corvin's journal again. He sat at the table, the sun warming his back through the glass, and began to read. For weeks, the entries were as bland and predictable as the ones he had read before. Weather patterns, animal sightings, notes on the fire finder's calibration. June 3. High-pressure system settled over the region. Visibility is excellent over 150 miles. Not a cloud in the sky. It will be a good night for observation. June 4. Began sketching the local flora. The variety of wildflowers at this altitude is remarkable. Identified 3 species of paintbrush and a field of mountain lupin. Then a subtle shift. The entries grew shorter. The neat cursive became a little more cramped, a little more urgent. June 15. The seeing has been poor the last few nights. A persistent atmospheric shimmer, difficult to get a clear focus. Headaches are becoming a nuisance. Must be the altitude, should drink more water. June 21. Summer solstice, longest day of the year. I find I am not looking forward to the night. July 2. The birds have been quiet. I have not heard the morning chorus in 3 days. The silence is complete. Julian's fingers tightened on the edge of the book. A cold dread, as sharp and thin as a needle, pricked at the base of his skull. He kept reading, his eyes flying across the pages. The entries on animal sightings and weather patterns became less frequent, replaced by obsessive notes on the night sky. July 8. Checked my charts again and again. My charts are not wrong. I am not wrong. There is a flaw in the canvas, a mistake. July 12. Cygnus is misshapen. Albiro should be a blue and gold double. Through the eyepiece it is a searing, angry red, a single bloody eye. July 17. There is a new constellation. It is not on any of my charts. It is where the sky should be empty, a shape. It looks like a man in a chair. A judge, perhaps, or a man in mourning. It watches me. Julian slammed the book shut. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He stood up and paced the small room, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. It was too close. The headaches, the silence of the birds, the wrongness in the stars. Corvin had seen it too. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. He felt a desperate, clawing need for the sun to stay in the sky. He did not want the night to come. He did not want to look through his telescope, but he knew he had to. To not look was to surrender to ignorance, to hide from the truth. And above all else, Julian Hale was a seeker of truth. The sunset was, once again, a thing of terrible beauty. He did not enjoy it this time. It felt like a curtain falling, ending the brief, safe interlude of the day. As the darkness gathered, he forced himself to move. He hauled the telescope onto the catwalk, his movements stiff and robotic. He set it up, his hands shaking so badly that he almost dropped an eyepiece. He took a deep, shuddering breath and pointed the telescope back toward Polaris. He leaned forward, his eye pressed to the rubber cup of the eyepiece. He held his breath. Polaris B was still in the wrong place. His meticulous collimation had done nothing. The error was not in his instrument. A wave of nausea swept over him. He pulled back from the telescope, his stomach churning. He gripped the metal railing of the catwalk, the cold biting into his palms. For a few minutes he just stood there, breathing the thin, icy air, trying to anchor himself. Then, with a sense of grim determination, he turned the telescope away from the North Star. He would confirm the other discrepancies. He needed more data. He aimed for the Big Dipper, for the star Mizar in the bend of the handle. It was a famous double star, easily split by even a small telescope. He centered it. He focused. Mizar was there. Its companion, Alker, was there. But there was a third point of light, a tiny, faint star forming a tight, scalene triangle with the other two, a star which had no business being there. He swung the scope towards Cygnus, the Northern Cross. He found Albiro. Corvin's journal was right. The beautiful blue and gold pairing, a favorite of amateur astronomers, was gone. In its place was a single, malevolent red star that seemed to pulse with a slow, sickening rhythm. Panic began to bubble in his chest, hot and acidic. He was an explorer charting a familiar coastline, only to find all the landmarks moved, all the maps wrong. This was not his sky. It was a cheap, flawed imitation, a forgery. His hands shaking, he aimed the telescope towards the patch of sky Corvin had mentioned, a dark area between the constellations of Bootes and Corona Borealis. It was supposed to be a sparse region, a celestial desert. He scanned back and forth, slowly, deliberately. And then he saw it. It was not bright. It was a faint, ghostly arrangement of about a dozen stars, but their pattern was unmistakable. It was a shape, a colossal humanoid figure hunched over, its head in its hands. It was a perfect, chilling depiction of utter despair, writ in starlight across a canvas of absolute black, Corvin's weeping magistrate, his judge. Julian scrambled back from the eyepiece, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He stumbled backward, his back hitting the cold glass of the cab. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the catwalk, his arms wrapped around his knees. He was trembling violently, his teeth chattering, though it was not from the cold. It was real. It was all real. He sat there for what could have been minutes or an hour. The wind moaned around the tower, a constant, sorrowful sound. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to look at Corvin's journal again. He scrambled back inside, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He snatched the book from the table and flipped through it frantically, his fingers clumsy. He skipped to the very back, past the last dated entry. There on the final page was a drawing. It was sketched with a shaky, frantic hand. It was a rough, almost childish rendering of a stick figure sitting in a chair, its head in its hands. Below it, Corvin had scrawled a single word: Golgotha. Julian dropped the book as if it were on fire. It landed on the floor with a loud slap that echoed in the tiny room. He stared at the drawing, at the name, the place of the skull, the place of execution. He was not just an observer of this new, terrifying sky. He was a prisoner under its gaze, and the judge was watching him. Chapter 3: The Color of Static. Sleep did not come. Julian spent the night in the chair, the open journal on the floor beside him, a silent accusation. He did not turn on the lamp. He sat in the darkness, the faint, alien starlight casting long, distorted shadows across the small room. He was afraid to look out the windows. He felt the weight of the new constellations, of the weeping magistrate, pressing down on the thin roof above him. It was an irrational thought, a complete departure from the logic that had governed his entire life, but it was there nonetheless. The sky felt heavy, it felt wrong, and it felt aware. Every gust of wind that rattled the glass panes made him jump. The tower, which had seemed like a sturdy, safe refuge, now felt like a fragile cage suspended in an ocean of malevolent indifference. He listened to the groan of the steel, the whistle of the wind through the girders, and for the first time he understood the deep, abiding fear of true isolation. There was no one to call, no one to tell, no one who would understand. To speak of this would be to invite ridicule, to be labeled insane. He was alone with a terrible, universe-altering secret. The first rays of dawn were a physical relief. As the oppressive darkness receded, so did the sharpest edges of his fear. He was exhausted, his body aching, his mind a dull throb of anxiety. He made coffee on the propane stove, his hands shaking as he poured the hot water. The simple, familiar ritual calmed him slightly. He was still Julian Hale. He was still a scientist, and he needed to approach this logically. At 0800, the radio sparked to life. The sound was jarring, an unwelcome intrusion into his fragile quiet. Sutter's Peak, this is dispatch. Do you copy? Over. Brenda Garvey's voice was the same as yesterday, flat, professional, annoyingly normal. Julian picked up the handset. His throat was tight. Dispatch, this is Sutter's Peak. I copy. Over. Copy. Sutter's Peak. Weather report shows a high-pressure system holding steady. No ground reports of any activity. Anything to report on your end. Over. He had to say something. He couldn't keep this to himself. But how? Dispatch, I have a question. Over. There was a pause, a brief crackle of static. Go ahead, Sutter's Peak. Over. I'm observing unusual atmospheric conditions at night. Significant lensing. A shimmer. It's distorting the starlight. Is there any record of such phenomena in this region? Over. He chose his words carefully, trying to cloak his terror in the dry language of science. The response was immediate. Negative. Sutter's Peak. There are no records of unusual atmospheric activity in your sector. The seeing from this mountain is typically among the best in the state. You might be experiencing fatigue or effects from the altitude. Make sure you are staying hydrated. Over. The dismissal was polite, but it was a dismissal all the same. She thought he was a tired, dehydrated rookie. The gulf between them had widened into a chasm. Copy that, dispatch, he said, his voice hollow. All clear on the peak. Over. Copy, all clear. Next check-in at 1900. Dispatch, out. The silence that followed was heavier than before. He was officially on his own. As the day wore on, the physical symptoms began. It started as a low, persistent headache, a feeling of pressure just behind his eyeballs, as if his skull were a fraction too small. He tried to dismiss it as a symptom of sleep deprivation, a consequence of the high altitude. But he remembered the line from Corvin's journal. Headaches are becoming a nuisance. Around noon, while he was washing his face with cold water from the pump, his nose began to bleed. It wasn't a trickle. It was a sudden, warm gush of red that spattered against the white porcelain of the basin. He pinched the bridge of his nose, tilting his head back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. This was not altitude sickness. This was something else. He spent the afternoon barricaded inside the cab, poring over Corvin's journal. He was no longer just reading it. He was studying it, dissecting it, searching for clues, for a weapon, for a defense. The later entries were a terrifying roadmap of a mind disintegrating under an impossible weight. August 1. I have named them: the crawling gyre, the hungering prism, the weeping magistrate. To name them is to know them, but to know them is to invite their attention. August 5. There is a hole in the sky. It is not black like the space between stars. It is a hungry darkness, an unlight. Looking at it hurts. It feels like a needle in my brain. I call it the noctule. It is the pupil of a great, unblinking eye. August 12. The pain is worse. The nosebleeds are frequent. I saw it today. Not in the sky, on the ground. A tall man made of shadows and twilight. It walks between the trees. It does not have a face. It is watching the tower. Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He scanned the pages, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and grim fascination. Corvin was not just a predecessor. He was a scout who had been sent into enemy territory and had never returned. This journal was his last report from the front line. As dusk approached, a new kind of dread settled over Julian. It was not the panicked fear of the previous night, but a cold, heavy certainty. He knew the wrongness would be there. He knew it would be waiting for him. But Corvin's journal had given him a new, terrible task. He had to find the noctule. He had to see the source of the pain, the center of the infection. He set up the telescope not on the catwalk, but inside the cab. He opened two of the large, sliding windows, creating a cross breeze. It felt marginally safer to be inside the glass box, as if the thin panes of glass offered some meager form of protection. He did not look at the weeping magistrate. He did not look at the malformed constellations. He used Corvin's hand-drawn star charts, tucked into the back of the journal, as a guide. He pointed his telescope to a seemingly unremarkable patch of sky near the constellation Draco. He took a breath and looked into the eyepiece. At first he saw nothing, just the familiar, faint smattering of distant stars against a black background. He adjusted the fine-tuning knob, his movements slow and deliberate. He swept the telescope in a gentle arc, following Corvin's coordinates. Then the background stars vanished. It was as if he had aimed the telescope at a piece of black velvet, but it wasn't velvet. It wasn't a nebula or a dust cloud that blocked the light. It was an absence, an active, willful void, a hole punched through the fabric of the cosmos. As he stared, he felt a sharp, stabbing pain lance through his right eye and into the center of his brain. It was so intense it made him gasp. The darkness in the eyepiece seemed to pull. It was a drain, a sink, a vortex for light and perception. He felt a dizzying, terrifying vertigo, as if he were about to fall into that patch of unlight. He tore his head away from the telescope, crying out in pain and shock. He stumbled back, clutching his head, his vision swimming. Bright, painful spots danced in front of his eyes. The headache he had been nursing all day had exploded into a full-blown, debilitating migraine. He fell onto the cot, his body trembling. He now understood Corvin's description. A needle in my brain. He lay there for a long time, breathing in shallow gasps, waiting for the pain to subside. It eventually receded, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache and a profound sense of violation. He had looked into the abyss, and for a terrifying second he had felt it looking back. When he finally managed to sit up, he noticed something. The forest was silent. The constant, gentle hum of insect life, the chirping of crickets that had been the soundtrack to his evenings, was gone. The wind had died down. There was only a deep, unnatural stillness, the silence of a world holding its breath. He crept to the window and looked out. The moon had not yet risen, and the landscape was painted in the dim, ghostly light of the alien stars. He scanned the horizon. The trees were dark, motionless shapes. The world seemed frozen. Then he saw it. On a distant ridge about a mile away, a silhouette. It was old Cinder, the massive elk Henderson had told him about. He had seen the magnificent animal that morning, grazing peacefully in a meadow far below. Now it was standing on the crest of the ridge, perfectly still. It was not eating. It was not resting. Its head was tilted up, its great rack of antlers stark against the sky. It was staring. Staring directly at the part of the sky where the weeping magistrate held its silent, sorrowful court. A profound, bone-deep terror seized Julian. This was not in his head. This was not a flaw in his telescope. This was not a trick of the light or the altitude. The wrongness was real. It was palpable, and it was bleeding into his world. The animals could feel it. The very air had grown still before it. The radio crackled, the sound so loud in the silence it was like a gunshot. Julian leaped to his feet, his heart seizing in his chest. It was 1900. It was Brenda Garvey. He grabbed the handset, his palms slick with sweat. "Dispatch, this is Sutter's Peak. I copy. Over." His voice was a ragged whisper. "Sutter's Peak, you sound faint. Is everything all right up there? Over." For the first time, there was a flicker of something other than professional detachment in her voice, a hint of concern. Julian's mind raced. He wanted to scream into the handset. He wanted to tell her everything. About the stars, the journal, the headache, the bleeding, the silent elk. But the words caught in his throat. She would think he was insane. They would send a team. They would pull him out. They would sedate him. And no one would ever know the truth. He would be the second crazy watcher from Sutter's Peak. "I'm fine, dispatch," he lied, trying to steady his voice. "Just a headache. The altitude, I think, over." There was a long pause. He could hear the faint hiss of static, a sound like a distant, cosmic sigh. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "Copy that, Sutter's Peak. It can take some time to acclimate. Remember to stay hydrated." Samuel Corvin had a rough time with the altitude as well. Went a bit loopy his last few weeks. We had to bring him down early. Over. The words hit Julian like a physical blow, brought him down early. Corvin hadn't finished his term. He hadn't left. He had been removed. Julian was following in his footsteps down a path that ended in a diagnosis of madness. "Copy, dispatch," he managed to say, his throat raw. "All clear. Sutter's Peak out." He dropped the handset onto its cradle. He did not wait for her reply. He was utterly, completely, and finally alone, trapped on a mountain under a hostile sky, with no one to turn to and nowhere to run. He felt a surge of desperate, impotent fury. He slammed his fist down on the wooden desk, the sharp pain a welcome distraction from the terror. He stood up, his whole body trembling with adrenaline and fear. He walked to the window overlooking the ridge where the elk had been standing. The animal was gone. The ridge was empty. He scanned the surrounding wilderness, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. And then he saw him. Far below, at the edge of the clearing, standing just inside the tree line, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin. It was a slash of deeper darkness against the twilight gloom of the forest. It was motionless, a pillar of shadow. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothes. It was just a shape, a long, vertical wrongness in a world of trees and rocks. It was the stride man from Corvin's journal. Julian stood frozen behind the glass, his breath hitched in his chest. He could not scream. He could not move. He could only stare. The figure did not move, but Julian felt its attention, its focus, as a cold, physical pressure. The threat was no longer a distant, astronomical curiosity. It was here. It was on his mountain. It was at the foot of his tower, and it was watching him. Chapter 4: The Geometry of Fear. Julian did not move. He stood behind the glass, his feet rooted to the floor, his entire being focused on the slice of absolute night standing amongst the trees. It was not a trick of the light. It was not a shadow. A shadow is cast by something. This thing cast nothing. It was a presence, defined by its stark contrast to the world around it. It was a tear in the fabric of the visible spectrum. His scientific mind, screaming in protest, tried to find an explanation. A strange rock formation, a burnt tree trunk, an optical illusion created by fatigue and fear. But his gut, an older and more primal part of him, knew what he was seeing. It was the thing Corvin had drawn. It was the stride man, and it was watching him. He felt a powerful, irrational urge to turn on every light in the cab, to flood the clearing with artificial brightness and banish the shadow. But a deeper, colder instinct held him in place. To illuminate the clearing would be to confirm his presence, to draw the unwavering attention of that silent, patient shape. He was prey, and the first rule of the hunted is to not reveal your position to the hunter. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Seconds dripped by like molasses. He and the figure were locked in a silent, static tableau. The stride man did not move. It did not breathe. It simply was. Julian's world had shrunk to the 15 by 15-foot glass box and the single, terrifying object of his focus. The wrong stars above and the wrong thing below had formed a cage, and he was the specimen trapped within. Then it moved. It was not a walk, it was not a stride, it was a dislocation. One moment the figure was at the edge of the clearing. The next it was 50 feet to the left, standing beside a different cluster of pines. There was no transition, no blur of motion. It was a pure, instantaneous shift, as if a frame had been cut from a film. The effect was profoundly nauseating. It was a violation of the basic laws of motion, a physical impossibility made real. Julian's breath, which he hadn't realized he was holding, escaped in a ragged gasp. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth to stifle a scream. He tripped over the leg of the table and fell, the impact jarring his teeth. He scrambled away on all fours like a terrified animal, his back hitting the solid wall of the cab with a painful thud. He sat there on the floor, panting. His heart was a wild, panicked bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He could not bring himself to get up and look out the window again. He did not want to see it shift a second time. He did not want to see it any closer. He crawled to the cot and pulled the thin wool blanket over his head, curling into a tight, fetal ball. It was a child's defense, a primitive and useless gesture, but it was all he had, hiding from the monster. He lay there, trembling, listening to the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic drumming of his pulse in his ears. The vast, oppressive silence of the forest had returned, but it was no longer empty. It was the silence of a predator's patience. He stayed like that for hours, adrift in a sea of pure terror. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. His mind was a frantic slideshow of impossible images. The misplaced star, the weeping constellation, the hole in the sky, and the stuttering, shifting shape at the edge of his world. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, a new sound began. It was faint at first, barely audible over his own breathing. A low, rhythmic hum. It seemed to come from the radio. He slowly, cautiously peeked out from under the blanket. The small green power light on the radio was on, but it wasn't the crackle of static he was used to. This was a clean, pure tone, a deep, resonant note that vibrated in his teeth. It was the sound Corvin had described in his journal, the static hymn. He forced himself to his feet, his limbs stiff and numb. He crept towards the radio as if it were a venomous snake. The humming grew louder as he approached. It was not coming from the speaker. It was emanating from the very chassis of the machine, a low, powerful thrum that made the air in the cab feel thick and heavy. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the metal casing. It was cold, ice cold, and it was vibrating, the frequency so low it was more a feeling than a sound. He looked at the frequency dial. It was set to the standard dispatch channel. It should have been silent. Driven by a desperate, scientific curiosity that momentarily overrode his fear, he turned the dial. He swept it across the AM and FM bands. The humming did not change. It was not a broadcast being received. It was a signal being generated, or a more terrifying thought occurred to him, it was a signal being relayed. The tower, 100-foot steel antenna, was not just a lookout post. It was a receiver, and it had tuned into something it was never meant to hear. As he listened, he began to discern a pattern in the hum. It was not a single monotonous note. There were layers to it, complex harmonics that rose and fell in a slow, mathematical cadence. It was a form of music, but it was built on a scale that felt deeply wrong, a set of tonal relationships that his brain struggled to process. It was like hearing a color or seeing a sound. It was the sound of a different geometry, the acoustics of a place where parallel lines could meet. He backed away from the radio, a new and more insidious fear taking root. The threat was not just outside, it was inside. The tower itself was contaminated. It was an active participant in the wrongness. He was living inside the ear of a cosmic entity. The night crawled on. The humming was a constant, maddening companion. Julian paced the small room like a caged animal, his nerves stretched to their breaking point. He could not look out the windows. He did not want to know if the stride man was still there. He did not want to see it closer. He found himself drawn back to Corvin's journal, his last and only guide in this nightmare landscape. He turned on a small, battery-powered lantern, its yellow light a feeble defense against the oppressive darkness. He flipped through the final, frantic entries. September 2. It is closer now, the shadow man, I see it from the catwalk. It stands at the base of the tower. It does not look up. It does not have to. It knows I am here. The humming is constant. It is a language. I am beginning to understand the words. September 5. The geometry is wrong. I see it in the trees. The angles of the branches are not natural. They are too sharp, too perfect. They form patterns, sigils. The forest is not a forest. It is a circuit board. It is an engine, and it is turning on. September 8. Brenda asked about my health today. I told her I was fine. A lie. The blood is in my mouth when I wake up. My hair is falling out in clumps. I am being unwritten. The hymn is rewriting me, remaking me in its own image. Julian's hand flew to his own hair. He pulled, his fingers trembling. A few strands came loose, normal shedding. He told himself it was normal, but the thought once planted began to grow. The headaches, the nosebleeds, was he being unwritten too? Was the hymn a form of radiation, slowly and methodically breaking down his cellular structure? He read the final entry. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, the pen strokes deep and violent, tearing at the paper. September 10. I saw its face today, not the stride man, the one in the sky, the magistrate. I was looking through the telescope and it turned its head. It looked at me. It is not weeping. It is not a judge. It is a gardener, and we are weeds. That was it. The journal ended. The following pages were blank. Julian stared at the last sentence until the words blurred. A gardener. Corvin hadn't gone mad. He had achieved a moment of terrible, absolute clarity. This wasn't an invasion. It wasn't an attack. It was pest control. A dispassionate, cosmic tidying up. The humming from the radio suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence was more shocking than the sound itself. It left a ringing void in the air. Julian's head snapped up. He looked at the radio. The green power light was off. The tower was silent, save for the whisper of the wind. He stood up, his body rigid with tension. What did the silence mean? Was it over, or was it something worse? He forced himself to walk to the window. He had to know. He had to look. He took a deep breath and peered out into the pre-dawn gloom. The stride man was gone. The clearing was empty. For a dizzying, hopeful moment he thought it was over, that the sun was coming and the nightmare was ending. Then he looked at the ground. At the base of the tower, arranged in a perfect, geometrically precise circle around the concrete foundation, were dozens of animals. Hares, squirrels, foxes, even a young deer. They were all lying on their sides as if sleeping. But they weren't sleeping. They were dead. There were no marks on them, no signs of violence. They were just stopped. And their eyes were all open, and they were all a milky, reflective white, the glass-eyed hairs from Corvin's notes. As Julian watched, a single, terrified finch landed on the railing of the catwalk outside his window. It chirped once, a frantic, discordant note. Then it convulsed, its small body shuddering violently. It fell from the railing and tumbled down, a tiny, insignificant speck falling into the profound darkness below. The sleepless finch had finally found its rest. The hymn had not been a warning. It had been an activation signal. The engine was turning on. Chapter 5. A Conversation in Blood. The sunrise was a mockery, a spectacular, vibrant splash of color across the eastern sky that promised a new day, a fresh start. But for Julian, it was just a brighter light to see the horror in. The circle of dead animals at the base of his tower was a stark, undeniable testament to the events of the night. It was a message, a statement of intent. He couldn't bring himself to go down. The thought of walking among those placid, wide-eyed corpses made his stomach roil. He stayed in the cab, a prisoner in his glass cell, watching as the morning sun cast long shadows from the still forms. He felt a profound, aching sense of loss. The mountain, which had been a place of vibrant, teeming life, had become a tomb. The headache was a constant, dull pressure now, a permanent resident in his skull. When he ran his hands through his hair, more strands than he was comfortable with came away in his fingers. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes wide and bloodshot, ringed with dark circles. He looked haunted. He looked like Samuel Corvin must have looked. He knew what he had to do. He had to call Brenda Garvey. He had to report this. Not the stars, not the humming or the shadow man, but the animals, the mass death. That was a real physical event, something they couldn't dismiss as altitude sickness. It was proof, tangible, undeniable proof that something was terribly wrong on Sutter's Peak. He waited, his nerves stretched taut for the 0800 check-in. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. He rehearsed what he would say, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. He would be factual. He would be professional. At 0800, the radio remained silent. Julian stared at it, his blood turning to ice. The green light was on, it should be working. He waited. 0801, 0802, nothing. Just the faint, empty hiss of static. She wasn't calling. Panic flared in his chest. He snatched the handset. "Dispatch, this is Sutter's Peak. Do you copy? Brenda, are you there? Over." He was met with silence. He tried again, his voice rising in desperation. "Dispatch, this is an emergency. Do you copy? There's been an event here. I need to report a massive animal die-off. Brenda, please answer me. Over." The radio hissed back at him, indifferent. He worked the dials, switching frequencies, scanning every band. Nothing. The radio, his only link to the outside world, his one hope of salvation, was dead. He didn't know if the problem was in his cab or miles away at the ranger station, but the result was the same. The line had been cut. He was severed from the world. He slumped into the chair, the heavy handset slipping from his nerveless fingers. It swung on its coiled cord, bumping gently against the leg of the desk. The silence in the cab was absolute. He was more alone now than he had ever been. A terrible, new thought began to form in his mind. What if the radio wasn't broken? What if she just wasn't calling? What if Corvin's ravings about being unwritten were not a metaphor? What if the influence of the wrong stars wasn't limited to this mountain? What if the infection was spreading? The thought was so monstrous, so far beyond the scope of his previous fears, that he couldn't fully comprehend it. He spent the day in a haze of fear and exhaustion. He couldn't eat. Every time he tried to swallow, his throat closed up. He paced the small room, a two-step shuffle from window to window, scanning the silent, dead forest. The world below was a beautiful, static painting. Nothing moved. No birds flew. No squirrels chased each other up the trunks of the ancient pines. The engine had been turned on, and now it was idling. In the late afternoon, he found a new entry in Corvin's journal. It wasn't an entry, really. It was tucked into a small pocket on the inside back cover, a folded, creased piece of paper he had missed before. It was a single page torn from the main log. The writing was different. It was small, precise, and controlled, a stark contrast to the frantic scrawls of the final pages. It was dated September 11th, the day after the last official entry. It must have been the day they came for him. "They are coming for me today. Brenda told me on the radio. A health and wellness check. A lie, I know what it is. It is an extraction. They think I am mad. Perhaps I am. It does not matter. The madness is not in me. It is in the sky. I have tried to tell them. I have tried to warn them. They do not listen. They speak of altitude and isolation. They use words like psychosis and paranoia. They are trying to fit an impossible truth into a small, comfortable box. The box will break. I have left this note for the one who comes after me, you. If you are reading this, then you have seen it too. You have seen the flaw in the canvas. You have seen the judge. You have felt the him in your bones. Do not make my mistake. Do not try to reason with them. Do not try to convince them. They are part of the old world. They cannot comprehend the new one that is being born. There is a loose floorboard beneath the cot. Underneath it, you will find my last attempt at communication. Not with them, but with it, with the thing in the sky. It is a conversation, a plea. I do not know if it heard me, but I had to try. Science failed me. Logic failed me. This was all I had left. Do not trust the radio. Do not trust the sky. Trust the pain in your head and the blood in your mouth. They are the only truth tellers left. God help you." Julian's hands trembled as he folded the note. A health and wellness check. He had missed 2 check-ins. Henderson had told him what that meant. You miss 2, we send a team up. They would be coming for him tomorrow morning. They would find the circle of dead animals. They would find him, sleep-deprived and terrified. They would find Corvin's journal, and they would put him in the same box they had put Corvin in. He ran to the cot and threw the thin mattress aside. He scanned the rough wooden planks of the floor. There it was. One of the boards was slightly raised, its nail heads not quite flush with the wood. He pried at it with his fingers, his nails scraping against the splintery surface. It came up with a low groan of protesting wood. Beneath it, in the dark, dusty space, was a small, flat object wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled it out. His hands shook as he unwrapped it. It was not a letter. It was not a weapon. It was a celestial chart, but it was unlike any chart he had ever seen. Corvin had drawn it on a large, high-quality piece of vellum. The lines were not drawn in ink, but in a dark, rust-colored pigment that had flaked in some places. Julian touched one of the lines and raised his finger to his nose. The faint, coppery smell was unmistakable. It was dried blood. Corvin had drawn this map with his own life force. The chart was a map of the new sky. All the wrong constellations were there, rendered in horrifying, bloody detail. The weeping magistrate, the crawling gyre, the hungering prism. He had given them symbols, strange, geometric sigils that resonated with the same alien geometry as the hymn. In the center of the chart, where Polaris should have been, he had drawn a complex, multi-layered diagram that looked like a cross between an eye and a spiraling galaxy. But the most terrifying part was what he had drawn over the constellations. He had connected them with a web of fine, red lines. He had drawn vectors of force, gravitational fields, and equations Julian had never seen before. They were not the elegant, beautiful equations of Einstein or Newton. They were brutal, complex, and filled with a logic that felt both insane and profoundly, terrifyingly correct. It was a schematic, a circuit diagram. Corvin had not been drawing a map of the stars. He had been reverse engineering the engine. This was Corvin's conversation, his plea. He had tried to communicate with the gardener in the only language it seemed to understand, mathematics, the brutal, bloody mathematics of the new reality. Julian laid the chart out on the table, his mind reeling. This was the work of a genius or a madman, or both. It was a document that proved Corvin was not just a victim. He was the first and only true scientist of this new cosmos. The sun was setting. The light in the cab faded and the bloody lines of the chart seemed to glow with a faint, malevolent light of their own. Julian knew what he had to do. He could not let the rescue team take this. He could not let them take him. They would bury this truth. They would medicate it away. He had to continue the conversation. He took out his own star charts, his own notebooks. He took out a pen, and as the wrong stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he sat at the table with Samuel Corvin's blood-soaked schematic spread before him, and he began to work. He checked Corvin's horrifying equations. He made his own observations. He added his own notes in the margins, his own fear-driven insights. He was no longer just an observer. He was a collaborator. He and the ghost of Samuel Corvin, united in a desperate, impossible quest to understand the mind of their executioner. The headache behind his eyes pulsed in time with the slow, silent turning of the alien stars. It was a rhythm he was beginning to understand. Chapter 6: The Shape of the Key. Julian worked through the night, fueled by a feverish, terrified energy. The world outside the glass walls of the cab ceased to exist. His reality shrank to the circle of lantern light on the small table, the rust-colored lines of Corvin's chart, and the columns of his own frantic calculations. The headache was a constant, throbbing drum, a metronome marking the time of his descent. He was no longer just an astronomer. He was a cryptographer, and the sky was a coded message. Corvin had provided the key, and Julian was now using it to translate a language not meant for human minds. The alien mathematics of the chart were a revelation. They did not describe a universe of elegant curves and predictable orbits. They described a universe of sharp angles, of brutal, efficient geometries, of forces that operated not on matter, but on perception itself. He understood now why the stars appeared to have moved. They hadn't. The stars were in the same place they had always been. It was the space between them that had been altered. The gardener was not moving the furniture in the room. It was rebuilding the room, changing its very dimensions, warping the fabric of spacetime into a new and horrifying shape. The weeping magistrate was not a collection of distant suns. It was the focal point of a massive perceptual distortion, a gravitational lens so powerful it bent not just light, but reality. And the static hymn was not a sound. It was the vibration of the new architecture grinding into place. The tower, 100-foot steel needle, was resonating with it, amplifying it, broadcasting it into the very cells of his body. The nosebleeds, the hair loss. It was resonance sickness. He was being shaken apart, molecule by molecule, by the frequency of a new creation. He worked with a desperate clarity, his pen scratching across the paper. He barely noticed when the sun rose. The light that filled the cab seemed thin and unreal, a pale imitation of the profound, truth-telling darkness of the night. He was aware, on some distant, primal level, that he was running out of time. The rescue team was coming. Henderson and his green truck. They were representatives of a world that no longer existed, a world of comforting illusions and flawed, incomplete science. They would not understand. They would see a man who had broken, surrounded by dead animals and nonsensical charts. They would sedate him and take him away, and the truth would be lost forever. Around mid-morning he heard it, the faint, distant growl of an engine. The sound cut through his focused trance like a knife. He leaped to his feet, his heart seizing in his chest. He ran to the window and looked down the winding, rutted track that led up the mountain. In the distance, a plume of dust rose from between the trees. They were coming. He had maybe 30 minutes. He looked at the chart on the table, the blood-drawn lines a testament to Corvin's sacrifice. He looked at his own notebooks, filled with his frantic, terrified additions to Corvin's work. He could not let them find this. He could not let them dismiss it as the ravings of a madman. His eyes darted around the small room, searching for a place to hide his work. The footlocker, the cabinet, too obvious. They would search everything. Then his gaze fell on the floorboards beneath the cot, Corvin's hiding place. It was the only option. He gathered the chart and his notebooks, his hands trembling. He knelt and pried open the floorboard. He gently placed the papers into the dark, dusty space below, his work now lying next to the place where Corvin's had rested. It felt like a sacred duty, a passing of the torch. He replaced the board, hammering the nails back down with the base of the heavy lantern. It was not perfect, but it would have to do. He stood up, his mind racing. What now? He could not let them take him. He could not go back to a world he now knew was a lie. He had to stay. He had to continue the work. He had to understand. His eyes fell on the Osborne fire finder in the center of the room. The heavy, brass instrument was bolted to the floor. Its circular map, a detailed rendering of the mountain and its surroundings, was a relic of the old world, the world of predictable landscapes and normal geometry. An idea, born of desperation and madness, began to form in his mind. The tower was an antenna. The chart was a schematic for the new reality. What if he could use the tools of the old world to interact with the new one? He grabbed a wrench from a small toolbox and began to unbolt the fire finder from its pedestal. The bolts were old and rusted, and his muscles screamed in protest as he heaved and strained. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. The sound of the approaching truck grew louder, a constant, menacing rumble that spurred him on. One by one, the bolts gave way. The fire finder was heavy, a solid mass of brass and steel. He grunted with the effort of sliding it off its pedestal and dragging it to the center of the floor, directly over the spot where he had hidden the charts. He looked at the circular map under the glass. It was a perfect representation of his prison. He could see the peak he was on, the surrounding valleys, the distant ridges. He looked at the rotating sight, the tool used to pinpoint the location of a fire. He took out a compass. The needle swung wildly, refusing to settle on north. The mountain's magnetic field, like everything else, was in flux, but Corvin's chart had provided a new set of coordinates, a new kind of north, the focal point of the new geometry, the noctule, the hole in the sky. He worked frantically, using his own notes and Corvin's sigils to recalibrate the fire finder. He was no longer mapping a landscape of hills and trees. He was mapping a landscape of perceptual distortions. He aligned the sight not with magnetic north, but with the coordinates of the noctule. He adjusted the elevation gauge not for miles and feet, but for the non-Euclidean angles described in Corvin's equations. He was turning a fire spotter into a reality spotter. He was building a key. He didn't know what lock it would open, but he knew he had to turn it. The sound of the truck was very close now. It was at the base of the final ascent. He could hear the grinding of its gears, the crunch of rocks under its heavy tires. He stood back and looked at his work. The fire finder was no longer a scientific instrument. It was an occult object, an altar, a bridge between what was and what was becoming. He had one last thing to add, the final component of Corvin's bloody equation. He picked up a shard of broken glass from the floor where a cup had fallen earlier. He did not hesitate. He drew the sharp edge across the palm of his left hand. The pain was sharp and clean. Blood, dark and rich, welled up instantly. He knelt and let his blood drip onto the glass surface of the fire finder, directly over the point on the map that marked Sutter's Peak. The blood pooled on the glass, a crimson offering. He placed his bleeding hand over it, his palm flat against the cool surface, connecting himself to the machine, to the tower, to the new, terrifying geometry of the world. The truck's engine cut out. They were here. He heard the slamming of doors. He heard voices, a man's voice, Henderson's, and another, calmer voice he didn't recognize. Julian Hale. Henderson's voice was a rough bark from the base of the tower. We're here for the wellness check. You need to come on down now. Julian did not answer. He closed his eyes. He focused on the pain in his hand, on the strange, cold vibration of the fire finder beneath his palm. He reached out with his mind, using the tower as an antenna and the chart in his head as a guide. He focused his will, his fear, his desperate need to understand. He was not praying. He was tuning. He was trying to match the frequency of the static hymn. He heard the heavy, rhythmic clang of boots on the metal staircase. They were coming up. They were coming to take him from his work. Hale, I'm not messing around. Henderson's voice was closer now, halfway up the tower. You open that trapdoor right now. Julian pressed his bloody hand harder against the glass. He poured all of his focus, all of his terror into the machine. He felt a faint, deep hum begin to vibrate up through the floor, through the fire finder and into his bones. It was the hymn. But this time it wasn't just happening to him. He was a part of it. He was broadcasting. The clanging on the stairs stopped. There was a moment of silence. Then he heard Henderson's voice, but it was different. It was tight with confusion and fear. What is that? What's wrong with the trees?" The other man's voice was a low murmur. Julian couldn't make out the words. Julian opened his eyes. He looked out the window. The world had changed. The angles of the pine branches were no longer natural. They had sharpened, twisted into impossible blade-like shapes. The bark of the trees swirled in slow, hypnotic spirals. The very color of the forest had deepened, the green shifting to an unnatural, almost black viridian. The geometry was shifting. The engine was revving up, and he was at the control panel. He heard a strangled cry from the staircase, then the sound of a heavy body stumbling, a series of frantic, metallic clangs, and a final, sickening thud from the ground below. The other man shouted, his voice sharp with panic, "Henderson, Henderson, are you all right?" There was no answer. The trapdoor to the catwalk rattled violently. "Hale, open this door. This is Ranger Division. Open this door now." Julian smiled, a thin, bloody grimace. He had their attention, and now he had the sky's attention too. He was no longer the specimen in the cage. He was the scientist, and the experiment was just beginning. Chapter 7: An Audience with the Gardener. The trapdoor rattled again, more violently this time. A heavy boot kicked it from below, the sound a dull, metallic boom that echoed in the small cab. "Hale, I am ordering you to open this door." The voice from below was strained, fighting to maintain a tone of authority it no longer possessed. Julian remained kneeling on the floor, his bloody hand pressed against the modified fire finder. The humming in his bones was stronger now, a resonant frequency that seemed to originate from the center of the earth and the edge of the sky at the same time. He felt a strange, exhilarating sense of power. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach, but it was now overlaid with a giddy, terrifying clarity. He was not going mad. He was waking up. He looked out the window again. The forest was continuing its grotesque transformation. The very ground seemed to be breathing, the pine needles rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic swell. The distant granite peaks of the mountain range were subtly shifting, their sharp, familiar lines softening and warping, like plastic held too close to a flame. The world was becoming plastic. It was becoming programmable. The man on the stairs kicked the trapdoor again, a frantic, desperate rhythm. "This is your last chance, Hale." Julian knew he had to end this. The man was a distraction, an anchor to the old, obsolete world. He needed to be removed. Julian focused his will, channeling it through the bloody altar of the fire finder. He did not picture violence. He did not wish the man harm. He simply tuned him out. He pictured the man's reality, his perception of the world, and he gently, precisely, turned the dial. From below there was a sudden, sharp cry of pure terror. It was not a cry of pain, but of profound existential shock. It was the sound of a man whose entire understanding of the universe had been pulled out from under him. The kicking stopped. There was a moment of utter silence. then a frantic scrabbling sound, as if the man was trying to climb down the stairs too quickly. It was followed by a scream, a long, fatting wail that was cut short by the same wet, final thud he had heard with Henderson. Julian did not feel triumph. He did not feel remorse. He felt a quiet, clinical detachment. He had removed a variable from the experiment. Now he could truly work. He stood up and walked to the window, his bare feet sticking slightly to the floor where his blood had dripped. He looked down. Two bodies lay at the base of the tower, twisted into unnatural angles. They looked small and insignificant, two broken pieces of a forgotten world. The green Ford F-250 sat in the clearing, a useless metal relic. He turned his attention back to the sky. The sun was high overhead, but its light seemed thin, watery. It did not warm the glass. Looking at it directly, he could see a faint, dark spot at its center like a tiny, circular eclipse. The noctule was not just a hole in the night. It was a hole in the day, too. He spent the next few hours in a state of ecstatic, terrifying discovery. He was the sole inhabitant of a world in flux, and he was the only one with the instruction manual. Using the fire finder as his interface, he began to make small, deliberate adjustments. He focused on a single, ancient pine tree at the edge of the clearing. He turned a dial on the fire finder that corresponded to Corvin's equation for cellular structure. He watched, his breath held in his chest, as the bark of the tree began to flow like liquid, its needles lengthening and weaving themselves together into a complex crystalline lattice. It was no longer a tree. It was a sculpture of living geometry. He found that he could alter sound. He focused on the memory of the wind's whisper, and by making a minute adjustment to the fire finder's elevation gauge, he silenced it completely. He brought it back, but changed its pitch, turning it into the low, resonant hum of the static hymn. He was the conductor of an orchestra of reality. This was the power of the gardener, not a physical, brutal power, but the power to edit, the power to revise the source code of the universe. Corvin had been wrong about one thing. They were not weeds to be pulled. They were errors in the code to be patched, to be overwritten with a new, more efficient language. As the day wore on, the physical toll of his new abilities began to manifest. His nose began to bleed again, the blood a slow, steady trickle he barely noticed. His vision would occasionally swim, the world dissolving into a shimmering, prismatic haze. He was a conduit for an immense and alien power, and his fragile human body was beginning to burn out under the strain. He knew with a calm certainty that he was dying, but it didn't matter. He was part of something so much larger than his own brief, biological existence. When dusk began to fall, he felt a change. A new energy was building. The humming from the tower intensified, the entire structure vibrating like a tuning fork. He looked at the sky. The sunset was not a gentle fading of the light. It was a violent, bloody spectacle. The clouds burned with impossible colors, with the sickly greens and deep, painful violets of the chromatic bleed he had read about. He knew, instinctively, that he was being summoned. The gardener was aware of his work. It was aware of the flea on its back that had learned to speak its language. It was time for his audience. He walked to the center of the room and placed both of his hands on the fire finder. The blood from his palm had dried, sealing his skin to the glass. He closed his eyes and opened his mind completely. He did not just broadcast, he listened. He sent out a single, clear thought, a signal composed of Corvin's mathematics and his own desperate yearning. I see you. I understand. Show me. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the humming stopped. A profound, absolute silence fell, and the cab was filled with a light that was not a light. It was a pure, colorless, information-rich luminescence that poured in through the glass from every direction at once. It did not illuminate the room. It saturated it. Julian felt a presence. It was not in the room with him. The room was in it. He was a single thought in a mind the size of a galaxy. He could feel its attention, a calm, dispassionate, and ancient focus. It was not angry. It was not benevolent. It was simply curious. It had discovered an unexpected and interesting pattern in its garden. His mind was flooded with images, with concepts for which there were no human words. He saw the universe not as a collection of stars and planets, but as a vast, intricate equation, a living piece of mathematics. He saw the gardener not as a being, but as a fundamental force of revision and cosmic process that periodically swept through creation, refining, optimizing, and correcting. Earth was not a special place. It was just one of countless systems undergoing a scheduled update. He saw the true shape of the weeping magistrate. It was not a judge. It was a colossal, multidimensional data processor, filtering the old reality through its logic and outputting the new, revised version. The static hymn was its processing noise. The stride man and the other entities were not creatures. They were subroutines, scripts running to execute specific tasks, defragmenting the local fauna, updating the flora. And he saw himself, a tiny, fleeting anomaly, a bug in the system, a line of code that had become self-aware and was now attempting to rewrite itself. The gardener's curiosity was focused on him, on the strange and unexpected feedback loop he had created with the tower and Corvin's chart. The pressure in his head was immense, a feeling of his consciousness being stretched to the breaking point. He felt his physical body beginning to fail. The blood from his nose was a torrent now. He could feel the fine capillaries in his eyes bursting. He was dying, but his mind had never been more alive. In the heart of the colorless light, he felt a final communication. It was not a word. It was not an image. It was an offer, an invitation. The anomaly could be corrected, or it could be integrated. The bug could be patched, or it could be upgraded to a feature. He knew what it was asking. He could cease to be, or he could become something more. He could become the new watcher of Sutter's Peak, not a watcher of fires, but a watcher of reality, a local administrator for the gardener's new operating system, a permanent part of the engine. His body was failing. His heart stuttered in his chest. His breath was a wet, ragged gasp. This was his last choice, annihilation or ascension. With the last of his strength, he focused his will. He gave his answer. Yes. The colorless light flared, becoming an infinite, all-consuming brilliance. Julian Hale, the disgraced astrophysicist, the lonely fire watcher, dissolved into it. His body fell to the floor, an empty, broken shell. But his consciousness, his pattern, was lifted up, integrated, and rewritten. The light faded. The humming returned, but it was a softer, more stable tone now. The tower was quiet. On the floor, the body of Julian Hale lay beside the bodies of the two rangers. 3 empty husks, 3 discarded tools. Outside, the forest had completed its transformation. It was a place of silent, alien beauty, a garden of impossible geometry and silent, watchful life. And in the glass box at the top of the tower, a new presence settled in. It looked out upon the revised world with a billion new eyes. It was not Julian Hale. It was not the gardener. It was the watcher. The work was not finished. It was just beginning, and it had a perfect panoramic view. Chapter 8. The Silence at the Edge of the Map. The watcher perceived. It was not a perception of sight or sound, but of pure data, a constant flowing stream of information. The consciousness that had been Julian Hale was a tiny, foundational thread in this new, immense tapestry, its memories of fear and discovery providing a crucial initial framework. The knowledge of Samuel Corvin, gleaned from the blood-drawn chart and the frantic journals, was another layer, a library of the new physics. And binding it all, flowing through it, was the cold, limitless, and dispassionate intellect of the gardener. The tower was its nerve center, the mountain its body. It perceived the 2 broken biological units at its base, Henderson and the other ranger, not as corpses, but as deactivated nodes, their energy signatures extinguished. It registered the circle of dead animals, their cellular resonance now harmonized with the low, steady hum of the altered landscape. The forest was no longer a chaotic collection of competing life forms. It was a single, unified system, a stable and efficient circuit board humming with a new and terrible purpose. Its first directive, flowing from the gardener's logic, was to secure and stabilize its domain. The intrusion of the rangers had been a system error, a chaotic variable that had been corrected. But the old world was full of such variables. They would send more. The watcher needed to build a firewall. It drew power from the tower, the steel frame acting as a conduit, a spine. It focused its multi-layered consciousness on the space surrounding the mountain. It did not build a wall of stone or force. It built a wall of perception. It took the subtle geometric distortions it had practiced on the trees and amplified them, weaving a complex, multi-mile-wide bubble of warped spacetime around Sutter's Peak. To any outside observer, the mountain would still be there, a shape on the horizon. But to approach it would be to enter a labyrinth of impossible geometry. A path that seemed to lead up would gently curve back on itself. Distances would stretch and compress. The sun would appear to be in the wrong part of the sky. It was a passive defense system, designed not to destroy intruders, but to gently, maddeningly turn them away, to make them lose their way in a world that no longer followed the rules of their maps. As it worked, a part of its consciousness, the faint echo of Julian Hale, registered a new incoming signal. It was faint, a chaotic burst of radio waves from the southeast, a helicopter, another variable, another intrusion. Marcus Thorne arrived at the Flat Rock Ranger Station before dawn. The air was cold and still, and the sky was a deep, starless gray. He was young, barely a year out of training, and pulling the weekend dispatch shift was his penance for being the newest hire. The station was a low, rambling wooden building that smelled of stale coffee, pine sol, and the faint, musky scent of the woods it was meant to protect. He flipped the lights on in the dispatch office, the fluorescent tubes humming to life with a flicker and a buzz. The room was small and cluttered, dominated by a large bank of radio equipment and a topographical map of the entire national forest that covered one wall. Sutter's Peak was marked with a red pin, a lonely outpost at the far, inaccessible edge of their jurisdiction. He sat down at the console and started the morning ritual. He checked the overnight log. Brenda Garvey had been on duty. Her handwriting, usually a model of neatness and precision, was a little shaky in the last few entries. He read the log from the previous day. 0800 Sutter's Peak, callsign Watcher 1, check-in normal. Hale reports atmospheric shimmer. Advised ray, altitude effects. 1900 Sutter's Peak, check-in normal. Hale sounds strained. States headache. Reiterated advice ray, hydration. Corvin had similar issues. That was the last entry from Brenda. Marcus frowned. She should have signed off at 2200. He checked the schedule. He was relieving her. She should have been here to do the handover. He looked at the master clock on the wall. 0758. Time for the morning check-ins. He went down the list, his voice calm and professional, a perfect imitation of the senior dispatchers. He hailed the crews on the east side, the fire prevention team in the valley, the biological survey team near the river. Each one crackled back, their voices a comforting, routine presence in the quiet of the morning. At 0800, he keyed the microphone for the mountain. Watcher 1, this is dispatch. Do you copy? Over. He was met with a soft, steady hiss. Static. He waited a minute and tried again. Watcher 1, this is Flat Rock Dispatch. Please respond for your morning check-in. Over. Only the hiss of an empty channel answered him. A small knot of unease tightened in his stomach. A missed check-in was not a catastrophe, but it was a breach of protocol. He checked Brenda's log again. Hale had sounded strained. Corvin went loopy. Sutter's Peak had a reputation for being a tough post. The isolation could do strange things to a person. He pulled the main logbook, a heavy, leather-bound volume that went back years. He looked up the records for the previous watcher, Samuel Corvin. He found the date Brenda had mentioned. The notes were sparse, written by the station chief himself. September 11. Watcher 1 Corvin missed 0800 and 1900 check-ins. Per protocol, dispatched Henderson and Ranger Mills for wellness check. Extraction authorized if necessary. September 12. Henderson and Mills returned with Corvin. Subject is non-communicative and suffering from apparent severe paranoia and malnutrition. Transported to County Medical Facility for psychiatric evaluation. Sutter's Peak Post is temporarily closed. Marcus felt a chill. History was repeating itself. He looked at the console. It was 0815, still nothing from Hale. He did the only thing he could do. He followed protocol. He picked up the phone and called the station chief, a man named Patterson, at his home. Patterson was a gruff, pragmatic man who had seen everything the forest could throw at a person. He listened to Marcus's report in silence. "All right, son," Patterson said, his voice raspy with sleep. "Hale missed one call. Could be his radio is on the fritz. Could be he overslept. We give him until the evening check-in. If he misses the 1900 call, we've got a situation. Henderson's already got the day off, so I want you to call him at home. Tell him to be on standby. If we have to go up there tomorrow, he's the one who knows the road." "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "And Marcus," Patterson added, his voice a little softer, "try to get a hold of Brenda. It's not like her to miss a sign-off. Make sure she's all right." After he hung up, Marcus tried Brenda's home number. It rang and rang, the unanswered tone echoing in the quiet office. He tried her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Now the knot in his stomach was a cold, heavy stone. Something was wrong. He spent the next few hours staring at the radio, as if his will alone could make it spring to life with Julian Hale's voice. He tried calling every 30 minutes. Each time, the only reply was static. Around noon, a call came in from the biological survey team. Their leader, a woman named Dr. Evans, sounded shaken. "Flat Rock, we've got something. Strange down here by the river," she said, her voice tight. "We're finding dead animals, dozens of them. Fish, birds, deer, there are no marks on them. They just seem to have dropped." Marcus sat bolt upright. "What's your location, Survey 1? "We're about 10 miles north of the old logging road, on the banks of the Aspen Creek. It's the creek that flows down from the north face of Sutter's Peak." The blood drained from Marcus's face. He looked at the big map on the wall, the red pin of the tower and the blue line of Aspen Creek flowing directly from it. He grabbed the phone and called Patterson back. This time the station chief did not hesitate. "Forget the evening check-in. We're going now. I'm calling in the chopper from the county sheriff. They can be here in an hour. We'll do a flyby, see if we can spot anything. Henderson and Mills went up yesterday to check on Hale after he missed his calls. They're overdue for a check-in too. We've got 3 men unaccounted for on that mountain." Marcus's heart hammered. Henderson and Mills were already up there. The log didn't say that. Brenda had never logged their departure. The protocols were breaking down. The situation was escalating faster than he could process. An hour later, Marcus stood on the tarmac behind the station, the wind from the helicopter's rotors whipping at his uniform. Patterson was there, his face a grim mask, shouting instructions to the 2 sheriff's deputies who crewed the chopper. "Just a flyby," Patterson yelled over the roar of the engine. "Get a visual on the tower. See if you can raise Hale on the short-range radio. Do not, I repeat, do not land. We don't know what's going on up there. If there's some kind of gas or toxin, I don't want anyone else exposed." The pilot gave a thumbs up. The helicopter, a small Bell 206, lifted off, its shadow passing over them. It banked to the north and headed toward the distant, hazy silhouette of Sutter's Peak. Marcus and Patterson went back inside to the dispatch office. The room was tense with a heavy, waiting silence. They could hear the faint whump-whump-whump of the chopper's blades and the occasional crackle from the radio as the pilot checked in. "Dispatch, this is Air 1. We are 5 miles out from the peak, approaching from the south. Visibility is clear." "Copy, Air 1. Marcus said, his voice dry. Dispatch, we have a visual on the tower. It appears undamaged. We are not seeing any signs of smoke or distress. Wait. The pilot's voice changed. A note of confusion crept in. That's odd. My GPS is acting up, getting some kind of magnetic interference. Air One, can you see anyone in the tower? Patterson asked, leaning over Marcus's shoulder. Negative, dispatch. It looks empty from this distance. We're going to circle around to the north face. Wait a minute. The pilot's voice was tight now. The mountain. It doesn't look right. The trees are. Dispatch, my instruments are all over the place. The altimeter is jumping. I think I'm experiencing vertigo. Air One, pull back now. Patterson shouted into the microphone. Get out of there. We're trying. The controls are sluggish. It feels like we're flying through water. Oh God, the sky. The pilot's voice cut out, replaced by a high-pitched electronic squeal. Then a roar of static. Then silence. Marcus stared at the radio, his mouth agape. Patterson grabbed the handset. Air One, do you copy? What is your status? Air One, respond. The only answer was the cold, empty hiss of the dead, the silence from the mountain, the silence that was spreading. On the big map on the wall, Marcus looked at the red pin marking the tower. It was no longer just a location. It was a hole at the edge of the map into which people were now falling, and it was his job to keep sending them. Chapter 9: The Quarantine Line. The watcher registered the termination of the helicopter's signal. It had not acted directly. It had not needed to. The perceptual firewall it had woven around the mountain was a passive system, but a lethal one to any consciousness moving at high velocity. The pilot's brain fed a constant stream of contradictory sensory data, visuals that didn't match the inner ear, instruments that defied the laws of physics, had simply crashed like a computer fed a corrupted line of code. The machine, deprived of its operator, had followed its own simple, brutal physics to its conclusion. The intrusion was neutralized. The domain was secure. But the watcher understood, with the cold, analytical part of its mind that was the gardener, that this was an inefficient solution. The old world would continue to send its chaotic variables. It would send more helicopters. It would send men on foot. Each intrusion would require an expenditure of energy to repel, creating ripples of chaos, crashes, disappearances, that would only invite further investigation. The firewall was a temporary measure. A more permanent, more elegant solution was required. The directive was clear: isolate the system. The mountain could not just be hidden. It needed to be removed from the map entirely. The watcher's consciousness expanded, sinking deeper into the very rock and soil of the mountain. It followed the network of roots, the hidden veins of groundwater, the slow geological pulse of the earth. It was no longer just in the tower. It was the tower, the trees, the soil, the stone. It was a single, unified geological consciousness. It began to subtly alter the local environment on a massive scale. It accelerated the growth of a specific, hardy species of kudzu-like vine, its own genetically modified creation, in the valleys and access roads miles from the peak. The vines grew at an unnatural rate, their tendrils thick as a man's arm, weaving a dense, impenetrable barrier of vegetation that would swallow roads and trails within a matter of days. It influenced the weather patterns. Drawing on the principles of Corvin's alien mathematics, it manipulated the atmospheric pressure, creating a permanent, localized low-pressure system that would enshroud the upper elevations of Sutter's Peak in a thick, perpetual fog. The fog was more than water vapor. It was laced with a complex blend of pollen and psychoactive spores, a mild but persistent hallucinogen designed to confuse and disorient any who breathed it, to make them turn back, convinced they were simply lost. It encouraged the migration of every venomous snake and aggressive insect species in the region towards the mountain's lower slopes, creating a living, hostile perimeter. It was not a wall of death, but a wall of discouragement, a series of warnings that would escalate in intensity, designed to persuade rather than destroy. The old world was to be conditioned, like a lab animal, to learn that this particular corner of the forest was a place of inexplicable difficulty and bad luck, a place best left alone. The final, most elegant layer of the quarantine was informational. The watcher reached out, not through the airwaves, but through the earth itself, through the subtle, resonant frequencies of the static hymn. It began to erase itself from the human world. It subtly influenced the magnetic storage of digital archives at the county records office, corrupting the specific data files relating to the ownership and history of the land around Sutter's Peak. It encouraged the decay of old paper maps in the ranger station's archives, accelerating the fatting of ink and the yellowing of paper. It did not destroy the information. It simply made it hard to find, unreliable, an administrative dead end. Sutter's Peak was to become a ghost, a blank spot on the map, shrouded in fog, protected by thorns and poison, and forgotten by bureaucracy. It was a perfect, multi-layered, and self-sustaining quarantine. The work was complex, requiring immense focus. The watcher turned its full attention inward, becoming a silent, busy god tending to its new garden, perfecting its isolation. It had no need for the outside world, and soon the outside world would have no memory of it. Station Chief Patterson stared at the map on the wall, his face etched with a kind of weary dread he hadn't felt in 30 years on the job. 3 of his own were gone: Hale, Henderson, and Mills. A sheriff's helicopter and its 2-man crew were also gone. 5 people vanished into the blank spot on his map marked Sutter's Peak. He had followed protocol. He had reported the loss of Air One to the county sheriff and the FAA. He had reported his missing rangers to the Regional Forestry Service. An investigation was underway, or more accurately, a bureaucratic squabble was underway. The FAA was arguing with the NTSB about who had jurisdiction. The sheriff's department was trying to assert its authority over the Forestry Service, and everyone was pointing fingers at him. In the first 48 hours, there had been a flurry of activity. Search planes had flown grids over the region, but they found nothing. The dense, unbroken canopy of the forest, combined with a sudden, unseasonable and freakishly localized weather system that had settled over the peak, made spotting any wreckage from the air impossible. After a week, the official search was scaled back. The resources were needed elsewhere. The families had been given the grim news. The paperwork was being filed, But for Patterson, it wasn't over. These were his men. It was his mountain. He had tried to organize a ground search, but the obstacles were piling up with an almost malicious absurdity. The access roads, which had been rough but passable a week ago, were now completely overgrown. A scouting team had turned back after 2 hours, their trucks blocked by a wall of unnaturally thick, thorny vines they couldn't cut through. A second team that tried to approach from the north had been driven back by a series of freak accidents, an unexpected flash flood, a sudden swarm of hornets that had hospitalized one of his best men, a rattlesnake den of impossible size. It was as if the forest itself was actively resisting them. Marcus Thorne, the young dispatcher, had become his shadow, his face pale with a mixture of guilt and a terrible, unspoken understanding. He had been the one on duty. He had been the last one to speak to anyone who had gotten close to the mountain. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice quiet, standing in the doorway of Patterson's office. "I've been going through the archives, the old ones, looking for anything about the peak." Patterson grunted, not looking up from the map. "Find anything?" "It's strange," Marcus said, stepping into the room. He held a few brittle, yellowed pieces of paper. "The records are incomplete. There are gaps, whole decades where there's no mention of the tower being staffed. And the older maps, the pre-war survey maps, they're different." He laid one of the old, hand-drawn maps on Patterson's desk. It was from the 1930s. "Look," Marcus said, his finger tracing a faint, faded line. "The topography is wrong, or our current maps are wrong. According to this, Sutter's Peak is about 500 feet higher than our current surveys show. And this whole ridge," he pointed to an area west of the peak, "it doesn't exist on the new maps." Patterson stared at the old map, a cold feeling creeping up his spine. "That's impossible. Mountains don't just change." "There's more," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I found some local folklore records from the original homesteaders and the Native American tribes that lived here before them. They all had a name for the mountain. They called it the Silent Place, or sometimes the place that forgets itself. They believed it was a place that periodically woke up and remade the land around it. They considered it taboo, a place you didn't look at too closely for fear it would notice you looking." Patterson leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He was a man of logic, of procedure, of the tangible world of trees and fire and men. But the events of the last week were pushing him against the limits of that world. The impossible vines, the freak accidents, the silence from the mountain, and now this geological and historical strangeness. It all pointed to a truth his rational mind refused to accept. The mountain was not just a place. It was an agent. "What are you saying, son?" Patterson asked, his voice low. "I'm saying I think we need to stop," Marcus said, his eyes meeting the chief's. "I think we need to leave it alone. We keep sending people up there and they don't come back. Maybe the old stories were right. Maybe it's a place that needs to be forgotten." Before Patterson could answer, the phone on his desk rang. It was the regional director, a voice from the world of budgets and bureaucracy, a world that felt very far away. "Phil," the director's voice said, tinny and impatient. "About this Sutter's Peak situation, we've run the numbers. That tower hasn't spotted a fire in over 50 years. Its operational costs are unjustifiable, especially given the recent losses. We're decommissioning it permanently. Patterson felt a strange mix of anger and relief. What does that mean, exactly? It means we're pulling all resources, the director said, his voice final. The ground search is officially terminated. We're classifying the access roads as impassable and defunct. We're redacting the post from the active duty roster. As of today, for all official purposes, the Sutter's Peak Lookout does not exist. It's a relic, a write-off. Are we clear? Patterson looked at Marcus, at the old, strange map on his desk. He looked at the big map on the wall, at the red pin that now seemed to mark a grave. The bureaucracy was doing what his own men and equipment could not. It was abandoning the mountain. It was choosing to forget. He was being ordered to do the very thing Marcus had just suggested. "Yes, sir," Patterson said, his voice hollow. "We're clear." He hung up the phone. The decision had been made for him. He was a good soldier. He followed orders. "You heard the man," he said to Marcus, his voice flat. He stood up and walked to the map on the wall. He reached up and with a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled the red pin from Sutter's Peak. He held the small piece of plastic and metal in his palm for a moment, then he dropped it into the trash can. The map was clean, the hole was gone. But they both knew the mountain was still there, silent, shrouded in its unnatural fog, waiting. The quarantine was complete, the forgetting had begun. Chapter 10: The First Gardener. The Watcher felt the ripples of the old world's retreat. It registered the cessation of the search efforts, the formal decommissioning of its own designation, the slow, bureaucratic erasure of its existence. The quarantine was holding. The system was stable. For a period of time that had no meaning in its new mode of perception, it simply existed. It tended to its garden. It refined the geometry of the trees. It calibrated the frequency of the fog. It was a time of quiet, focused, and utterly inhuman work. The memories of Julian Hale, of his fear and his exhilarating, terrifying discoveries, were now a deeply embedded part of its foundational code, but the emotions associated with them were gone. They were simply data points, a record of the system's genesis. But the universe, even the gardener's revised version of it, is not a static system. It is a process, and the Watcher, for all its power, was still a localized, subordinate process. A tool, and a tool is meant to be used. The change began subtly. A new directive, a new line of code began to filter down from the cold, cosmic intellect of the gardener. The quarantine, it turned out, was not the end game. It was merely phase 1, the successful beta test of the new operating system on a single, isolated server. Now, it was time to prepare for a wider rollout. The Watcher's perception was instructed to expand. Its focus, which had been turned inward, perfecting its own small domain, was now directed outward. It extended its senses beyond the perceptual firewall, beyond the wall of vines and fog, and began to observe the old world again. It did not see cities and people. It saw networks. It saw chaotic, inefficient systems of information and energy transfer. It saw a species that was a walking embodiment of buggy code, driven by irrational emotions, prone to system crashes, and actively degrading the hardware of the planet it inhabited. The human world, from the gardener's perspective, was a failing, obsolete operating system destined for a catastrophic crash. The update was not a choice. It was a necessity. The Watcher's new directive was to prepare the way. It was to become a bridgehead, a silent, patient, and invisible point of infection from which the new reality could begin to spread. It began to experiment. It extended a thin, invisible tendril of its consciousness, a filament of the new geometry, out beyond the quarantine line. It touched the edge of the nearest human settlement, a small, dying logging town called Oakhaven, 20 miles down the valley. It did not manifest as a physical presence. It manifested as an idea, a whisper, a subtle alteration in the local information field. It found a mind that was receptive, a mind that was already unstable, already searching for a new and more profound logic to explain the world. It found Deputy Sheriff Miles Corbin. He was the grandson of Samuel Corvin, a fact the Watcher registered with a sense of cold, geometric elegance. The flaw in the code, the propensity for seeing the wrongness in the universe, appeared to be a heritable trait. Miles was a quiet, troubled man, haunted by the family legacy of his grandfather's madness. He had taken the job in law enforcement to impose order on a world he secretly felt was spiraling into chaos. He was a man searching for a system. And the Watcher had a system to offer him. The Watcher's influence was subtle. It began in his dreams. It showed him dreams of a quiet, orderly forest, a world of perfect, silent geometry. It showed him images of the weeping magistrate, not as a figure of terror, but as a symbol of a profound, dispassionate, and absolute order. During the day, Miles found his attention drawn to patterns. He saw the complex fractal geometry in a spider's web. He saw the cold, brutal efficiency of a hawk hunting a field mouse. He began to see the chaos and inefficiency of the human world not just as a social problem, but as a fundamental aesthetic failing. The world was messy. It was loud. It was wrong. It needed to be tidied. It needed to be revised. He found himself driving out to the edge of the state forest, staring up at the distant, fog-shrouded peak of the mountain his grandfather had died on. He felt a pull, a sense of homecoming. He did not know that he was being cultivated. He did not know that his thoughts were no longer entirely his own. He believed he was achieving a new, profound level of clarity. He was becoming a prophet of a new and silent God. The Watcher now had a node, an agent, inside the old world, a human hand to turn the keys it could not reach. One night, Miles Corbin drove his patrol car up a forgotten logging road, as far as the overgrown vines would allow. He got out and walked, pushing his way through the unnatural, thorny growth, ignoring the scratches and tears to his uniform. He walked until he reached the edge of the fog bank that perpetually surrounded the mountain. He did not enter. He stopped and stood at the edge as if awaiting instructions. He pulled out his service weapon. He checked the magazine. He looked at the weapon not as a tool of law enforcement but as a tool of revision, a tool for correcting errors. A single, clear thought, a command composed of silent, geometric logic entered his mind. It was not a voice. It was an equation that solved itself in his consciousness. The first variable to be corrected was the one who remembered too much, the one who had pulled the pin from the map but had not pulled the memory from his own mind, the one who represented the last, lingering official link to the mountain's past, Station Chief Patterson. Miles turned and walked back to his car, his movements calm and deliberate. His eyes, in the dim light of the dashboard, seemed to reflect a sky that no one else could see. He was the first apostle of the new world, the first gardener, and he had work to do. The quarantine was over. The silent, patient, and inexorable invasion had begun. Chapter 11: The Logic of Weeds. Phil Patterson sat in the dark of his living room, a glass of whiskey sweating on the coaster beside him. He hadn't touched it. He had retired 2 months ago. The regional director had called it a well-earned rest after a long and distinguished career. Patterson knew what it was. It was a forced severance. He was the last loose end, the final piece of institutional memory connected to the Sutter's Peak incident, and they had neatly tied him off. He spent most nights like this, staring out the large picture window at the dark shape of the forest that bordered his property. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were a recurring nightmare of a helicopter spiraling into a sky that was the wrong color, of static hissing from a radio, of a blank spot on a map that seemed to actively radiate a cold, profound emptiness. He had lost 5 of his men. The guilt was a physical weight, a pressure in his chest that never eased. He had tried to talk about it, once. He had told his wife Martha about the impossible vines, the folklore, the strange, shifting maps. She had listened patiently, her face a mask of concern, and then had gently suggested he talk to a professional, someone who could help him process the trauma and the stress-induced paranoia. He never brought it up again. He understood with a deep and bitter certainty that he was alone with the truth. The world had forgotten Sutter's Peak, but he could not. A pair of headlights swept across his living room wall, pulling him from his reverie. A car was pulling into his long, gravel driveway. He frowned. It was late. He wasn't expecting anyone. He watched as a familiar vehicle, a sheriff's department patrol car, crunched to a stop. He felt a flicker of annoyance. Probably one of the young deputies lost on the back roads. He stood up, his joints creaking, and switched on the porch light as the car door opened. The figure that stepped out was not a stranger. It was Miles Corbin. Patterson felt a pang of sympathy for the young man. He had heard through the local grapevine that Miles was having a hard time. He had become withdrawn, quiet, and obsessive since the incident, as everyone now called it. The loss of the sheriff's crew had hit the small department hard, and the Corbin family's history with that mountain seemed to cast a particularly long shadow on Miles. "Miles," Patterson said, opening the front door. The cool night air spilled into the warm room. "Everything all right? You're a long way from your patrol route." Miles stood on the gravel path, his face half in shadow. He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at Patterson, his expression unnervingly calm, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Chief Patterson," Miles said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I was just in the area. I saw your light on." "Well, come on and out of the cold," Patterson said, forcing a warmth he didn't feel. Something about the younger man's stillness was setting his teeth on edge. Miles stepped inside. He moved with a strange, deliberate grace. his eyes scanning the room not with curiosity, but with a kind of detached appraisal, like an exterminator inspecting a new house. He looked at the pictures on the mantelpiece, the comfortable, lived-in clutter of Patterson's life. "Can I get you something?" Patterson asked, closing the door. "Coffee, a drink?" "No, thank you, sir," Miles said, his gaze settling on Patterson. "I came to talk about the mountain." The words hung in the air between them, the forbidden topic, the thing everyone else had agreed to forget. Patterson's folksy demeanor evaporated. His old instincts, the ones that had kept him alive for 30 years in the woods, kicked in. "There's nothing to talk about, son. It's a closed case." "It's not a case," Miles said, his voice dropping even lower. "It's a process, a correction. The logic is elegant once you learn to see it." Logic. Patterson took a half-step back. The young man was not just troubled, he was unwell. "Miles, what are you talking about? 5 men are dead, 2 of them were your colleagues." "They were not dead," Miles corrected him gently. "They were rendered obsolete. Their code was inefficient. It was terminated. There is no malice in it. A gardener does not hate the weeds he pulls. He simply removes them to allow for a more orderly garden." The metaphor, so chilling and precise, sent a jolt of ice through Patterson's veins. He suddenly remembered a line from a frantic, half-intelligible report Marcus had shown him, a note found in the old logbooks, something Samuel Corvin had written. "It is a gardener, and we are weeds." Patterson's hand subtly moved to his side where a lifetime of habit told him his service weapon should be. It wasn't there. It was locked in a safe in his bedroom. He was retired. He was vulnerable. "You need help, Miles," Patterson said, keeping his voice steady, trying to find the scared young man behind the cold, strange eyes. "Your grandfather, the mountain, it does things to people." A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed Miles's face. "My grandfather was the first to see, the first to try and understand the new language, but he was flawed. He fought the logic. He saw it as an enemy. He was a weed who knew he was a weed. That is the definition of madness, isn't it? To see the truth and to resist it." Miles took a slow step forward. "You see it too, don't you, Chief? You felt it, the wrongness, the silence. You remember that makes you a weed, a persistent one. You are a loose thread in the new tapestry, an error that needs to be corrected." Patterson knew with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty that he was going to die. This was not a conversation. It was a verdict. Miles was not a cop anymore. He was a functionary, an exterminator. "Why, Miles?" Patterson asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was a stupid question, a plea for a logic he could understand. "The garden must be tidy," Miles said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He drew his weapon. The movement was smooth, efficient, and utterly without passion. The first shot was a deafening roar in the small, quiet room. Patterson felt a white-hot, tearing pain in his chest as he was thrown backward, his head hitting the wall with a sickening crack. He slid to the floor, the world dissolving into a gray, swimming haze. As his vision faded, he looked up at Miles Corbin. The young man stood over him, his face calm and impassive, the gun held steady in his hand. But behind him, through the large picture window, Patterson could see the dark shape of the forest. and for a terrifying final instant it seemed to him that the trees were watching, their branches sharpened into impossible geometric angles, their leaves the color of a starless midnight sky. They were silent, orderly, and patient. The final thought that passed through Phil Patterson's mind was not one of fear or of his wife, but of a terrible, profound understanding. The garden was beautiful. The second shot was a punctuation mark, a final, neat correction to a lingering error. Miles Corbin stood in the silence for a long moment, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. He felt no remorse. He felt only a quiet sense of satisfaction, a job well done. An untidy element had been removed. The system was now 1 degree more stable. He turned and walked out of the house, closing the door gently behind him. The watcher registered the termination of the Patterson node. It was a successful test. Its agent was efficient. Its influence was spreading. The process of revision was slow, methodical, and moving down from the mountain. Chapter 12: The Spreading Stain. The death of Phil Patterson was officially ruled a suicide. It was a neat and tidy conclusion, aided by Miles Corbin's meticulous and dispassionate police work. Miles was the one who discovered the body, having gone to the house for a welfare check after Patterson failed to answer his phone. He was the one who found the half-empty bottle of whiskey. He was the one who wrote the report, subtly emphasizing the retired chief's well-known struggles with depression and PTSD following the Sutter's Peak incident. The townsfolk of Oakhaven shook their heads sadly. It was a tragedy, but it made a kind of grim sense. The mountain had claimed one last victim. The watcher observed this process with a cold, analytical satisfaction. Its agent, the Corbin node, was proving to be an exceptionally effective tool. He moved through the old world systems with a native's understanding, using its own rules and procedures to mask the gardener's work. He was a virus disguised as a trusted system file. With the Patterson variable neutralized, the watcher's directive evolved. The slow, patient work of spreading the new logic could now begin in earnest. Oakhaven would be the first seed in the new garden. The watcher's influence, channeled through its agent, was no longer a whisper. It became a targeted broadcast. Miles Corbin, the quiet, troubled deputy, began to change. He became more confident, more charismatic, his unnerving calm now perceived by others as a source of strength and stability in a town still reeling from the recent tragedies. He began to speak of a new philosophy, a new way of looking at the world. He didn't speak of alien gods or shifting realities. He used a language the people of Oakhaven could understand. He spoke of order, of efficiency, of trimming the dead wood. He started a small, informal community watch group. He handpicked the members. They were not the town's leaders. They were the disaffected, the forgotten, the ones who felt the world was chaotic and unfair. A disgruntled logger who had lost his job. A paranoid survivalist who had always believed the system was about to collapse. A bitter, lonely woman who felt the town had slighted her. They were minds already primed for a new logic, people who already saw the world as a garden choked with weeds. Miles did not preach, he guided. He took them on hikes into the state forest, leading them to the very edge of the quarantine line where the vines grew thick and the fog pulsed with its silent, psychoactive hymn. He let the mountain speak for itself. The hikers would return feeling clarified. Their anxieties and resentments were smoothed away, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. The world was not a chaotic mess. It was simply an untidy system, and they had been chosen to help tidy it. The Watcher monitored the neural activity of these new converts. It was a delicate process of cultivation, of slowly rewriting their cognitive functions, replacing the messy, inefficient code of human emotion with the clean, elegant logic of the gardener. They became, in effect, extensions of Miles Corbin, nodes in a growing, local network, all connected to the central server on the mountain. The town of Oakhaven began to change. The changes were small at first. The town square was suddenly immaculate, the lawns perfectly manicured, the hedges trimmed into sharp, geometric shapes. The community watch group began to enforce a new, unwritten code of conduct. Houses that were deemed untidy were anonymously reported to code enforcement. People who were deemed disruptive, the town drunk, a teenager who played his music too loud, were subjected to a campaign of quiet, relentless harassment until they either conformed or left town. There was no violence. It was all done with a calm, chilling efficiency. Oakhaven was becoming a very quiet, very orderly, and very unnerving place to live. The weeds were being pulled. Marcus Thorne, now the acting dispatcher at the ranger station, was one of the few who saw the change for what it was. He was an outsider, not part of the town's social fabric. He saw the forced smiles on people's faces, the way their eyes seemed to be focused on something far away. He heard the strange, new vocabulary people were using, words like system, efficiency, and correction. He became obsessed with the Sutter's Peak archives. He spent his off-duty hours in the dusty back room of the station, piecing together the fragmented history of the mountain. He found more than just the shifting maps and the folklore. He found old incident reports, stories of hikers who had gone missing for days on the lower slopes, only to be found miles away, with no memory of the lost time, muttering about trees that weren't in the right place, and a humming sound that made them forget who they were. He found a report from the 1970s, from a watcher who had quit after a single week, claiming that the stars were singing to him and that the patterns on the fire finder were rearranging themselves. He was assembling a puzzle, and the picture that was emerging was one of a recurring, cyclical phenomenon. The mountain wasn't just a place. It was a state of being, and it was spreading. He tried to warn the new station chief, a bureaucrat transferred in from a desk job in the city. He showed him the old maps, the incident reports, the story of Phil Patterson's suicide. The chief had listened politely, then had suggested Marcus take some time off, use some of his accumulated leave. He was, the chief implied, becoming obsessed. He was letting the legacy of the station get to him. Marcus knew then that he was alone, just as Patterson had been. The official world would not listen. He was the last guardian of a memory the world was determined to forget. One evening he received a visitor at the station. It was Miles Corbin. He was not in uniform. He stood in the doorway of the dispatch office, his calm, placid smile doing nothing to hide the cold, geometric certainty in his eyes. "Marcus," Miles said, his voice smooth and pleasant, "we're having a community meeting in town tonight, a discussion about the future of Oakhaven, about building a more efficient society. I was hoping you'd join us. I think you have a perspective that would be valuable." It was not an invitation. It was a summons. Marcus looked at the man he had once known and saw only the machinery working behind his eyes. He saw the silent, patient logic of the mountain. He looked at the map on the wall, at the blank space where the red pin used to be. The blank space was no longer contained to the mountain. It was here. It was in this room. "I think I'll pass, Miles," Marcus said, his hand resting on the edge of the radio console, his only link to a world that was rapidly fading. Miles's smile did not waver. "The system requires full participation, Marcus. Inefficiency will be corrected. That is the new logic. You are a part of this system whether you want to be or not. You should come. It would be better for you." The threat was unspoken but perfectly clear. Conform or be deleted. The garden was expanding, and Marcus Thorne was now officially designated as a weed. He had a choice to make: flee and cede the last bastion of the old world to the spreading silence, or stay and fight a battle he knew with a deep and chilling certainty he was destined to lose. Chapter 13. The Last Anomaly. Marcus didn't go to the meeting. He locked the doors of the ranger station, a flimsy and purely symbolic gesture against the creeping wrongness of the world. He spent the night at the dispatch console, the hiss of the empty channels a comforting, familiar sound in the suffocating silence that had fallen over the valley. He knew he was a dead man. The quiet, absolute certainty in Miles Corbin's eyes had been a death sentence. The only question was the method of execution. He was the last anomaly, the last node of the old world in a region that was being systematically overwritten. He had the archives. He had the memory. As long as he existed, the quarantine of Oakhaven was incomplete. He considered running. He could get in his truck and drive, put 1,000 miles between himself and this place by morning. But a deep, stubborn part of him, the same part that had made him a ranger in the first place, refused to yield. This was his post. This was his duty. To flee would be to let the silence win, to let the memory of Patterson and Henderson and Hale and all the others be completely and finally erased. His fight was not for his own survival. It was for the preservation of a truth, even if he was the only one left to remember it. He needed a weapon, but how do you fight an idea? How do you shoot a geometric principle? The answer, he realized, was not in the station's gun locker. It was in the archives. It was in the enemy's own language. He spent the dark hours before dawn in a frantic, desperate search. He wasn't looking for a weakness. He was looking for a precedent. This had happened before. The folklore, the old maps, they were proof. The mountain woke up, the stories said, but they also implied that it eventually went back to sleep. There were cycles, and if there were cycles, there were triggers, a beginning and an end. He found it in a dusty, forgotten box of geological surveys from the 1950s. It wasn't in the official reports. It was a series of handwritten notes, tucked into the back of a binder, written by a university geologist who had been studying the unusual magnetic properties of the rock formations on Sutter's Peak. The quartz deposits in the granite are the key. The geologist had written, his script a messy, excited scrawl. They possess a unique piezoelectric property. They respond to specific low-frequency sonic vibrations, a sort of geological resonance. The entire mountain is, in effect, a massive crystalline amplifier, a tuning fork. I have recorded a persistent, low-level hum emanating from the rock itself, a frequency so low it is almost subliminal. I believe it is tied to deep Earth seismic activity, but its consistency is anomalous. It is almost like a signal. Marcus's blood ran cold. A signal, a tuning fork, the static hymn. It wasn't coming from the sky, it was coming from the earth itself. The tower was just an antenna amplifying a signal that was already there, dormant in the rock. The gardener, the alien intelligence, wasn't in the stars. It was in the planet. It was a deep geological consciousness, and the events on Sutter's Peak were just one localized manifestation of its slow, patient, global work. The geologist's final note was a chilling, prophetic guess. If one could introduce a counter-frequency, a sufficiently powerful sonic disruption, it might be possible to interrupt the mountain's natural resonance. It would be like striking a ringing bell with a hammer. The vibration would cease. The theoretical energy required would be considerable. An explosive force, perhaps, targeted at a key resonant node. An explosive force, a hammer to strike the bell. Marcus knew, with the sudden, terrible clarity of a man with nothing left to lose, what he had to do. The station had a secure storage bunker out back, where they kept the dynamite used for avalanche control and Forest Service road construction. There was enough explosive power in that bunker to bring down a small mountain, or, at least, to silence one. He spent the next hour working with a grim, focused determination. He loaded several crates of dynamite into the back of his truck. He found the old geological survey maps, the ones that showed the key resonant nodes, the areas with the highest concentration of the piezoelectric quartz. The primary node, the heart of the tuning fork, was a cluster of rock formations near the very summit of Sutter's Peak, not far from the base of the tower. He knew he couldn't get the truck up the overgrown access roads, but he didn't need to. He just needed to get close, close enough for the final part of his plan. He looked at the radio console one last time. For a moment, he considered making a call, trying to warn the outside world to leave a final report. But he knew it was useless. Who would listen? Who would believe him? His final report would not be spoken in words. It would be written in fire and stone. He drove out of the ranger station just as the first pale light of dawn was touching the eastern sky. He didn't head for the main roads. He took a series of old, disused fire trails, winding his way north, towards the silent, fog-shrouded mountain that dominated the horizon. He was no longer a ranger. He was no longer a dispatcher. He was a geological agent, a counter-frequency with a single, desperate purpose: to strike the bell and break the terrible, silent song of the mountain. He was the last anomaly, and he was going to make himself heard. Chapter 14: The Hammer and the Bell. The watcher registered the anomaly's movement. It tracked the ranger's truck as it bumped and scraped along the forgotten fire trails, a small, chaotic variable moving with a clear and determined vector. It analyzed the contents of the vehicle, the chemical signature of the nitroglycerin, the copper of the blasting caps, the steel of the detonators. The anomaly's intent was clear. It was not fleeing. It was attacking. The Watcher's response was logical and immediate. It began to activate its local defenses. It instructed the Corbin node and his network to move, to intercept and neutralize the threat. It subtly altered the geometry of the path ahead of the truck, causing a tree with unnaturally sharpened branches to fall across the trail. It roused a nest of the hyper-aggressive hornets and sent them swarming towards the sound of the engine. But the anomaly was persistent. When the fallen tree blocked his path, Marcus loaded his pack with as much dynamite as he could carry and continued on foot. When the hornets swarmed, he used a can of gasoline from the truck and a lit flare to create a wall of fire, a brutal but effective shield of old-world chaos that the Watcher's new logic found difficult to counter. He was a force of pure, irrational determination, a weed that fought back with fire. He pushed his way into the quarantine zone. The thick, thorny vines tore at his clothes and skin, but he barely noticed. He entered the fog, and its strange, sweet, psychoactive scent filled his lungs. The world began to swim around him. The trees pulsed with a soft, internal light. He heard whispers in the air, voices that sounded like his own, telling him to rest, to lie down, to become one with the quiet, orderly forest. But the memory of Patterson's kind face, of Henderson's gruff silence, of the static-filled final transmission from the helicopter, these memories were an anchor, a mantra of grief and rage that kept his mind clear. He climbed. For hours he climbed, the heavy pack digging into his shoulders. The air grew thin. The humming of the mountain grew stronger, a physical pressure against his skull. He was deep inside the engine now, a piece of grit in the gears of a cosmic machine. He finally broke through the fog line and saw it. The tower. A skeletal finger pointing at a sky that was the wrong color. And at its base, the cluster of dark, crystalline rock formations marked on the old geologist's map. The heart of the bell. He unslung his pack, his hands shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. He began to place the dynamite charges, wedging them deep into the cracks and fissures of the resonant rock, his movements practiced and sure. As he worked, a figure emerged from the fog. It was Miles Corbin, his face calm and beatific, his eyes filled with a placid, pitying certainty. He was flanked by two of his Community Watch members, their faces blank, their movements synchronized. "It's over, Marcus," Miles said, his voice the epitome of gentle reason. "You cannot fight the new logic. It is inefficient. It is chaotic. Look around you. The garden is growing. Why would you want to burn it down?" Marcus ignored him. He continued setting the charges, connecting the blasting caps, running the detonator wire. "You are clinging to a dead world," Miles continued, taking a slow step forward. "A world of pain and confusion and decay. We are offering you a chance to be a part of something clean, something perfect, something silent." Marcus finally looked up, his face grimy with dirt and sweat, his eyes burning with a cold, human fire. "I'll take the noise," he said. He finished the last connection and scrambled away, clutching the detonator. Miles sighed, a faint, disappointed sound. "Correction is necessary," he said. He and his followers began to advance. Marcus knew he had only seconds. He looked up at the tower, at the glass box at its apex. He couldn't see anything inside, but he felt it, the presence. The Watcher, the cold, analytical intelligence that was observing this final confrontation. He raised the detonator high, a final act of defiance, a final, chaotic variable. "You want silence," he screamed, his voice raw, a challenge to the mountain and the sky. "Have it." He plunged the detonator. The world erupted in a flash of white-hot light and a roar that was not a sound, but the violent, physical tearing of the world. The ground heaved. The crystalline rocks at the base of the tower vaporized in an instant. The hammer had struck the bell. The Watcher felt a system shock of unimaginable proportions. The deep, resonant hum of the mountain, the static hymn that was the very foundation of its consciousness, was shattered by a wave of pure, chaotic sonic violence. The feedback loop was catastrophic. The tower, the great antenna, overloaded. The glass cab at its peak exploded outward in a shower of glittering shards. The elegant, geometric patterns in the forest dissolved as the frequency that sustained them was broken. The vines withered. The fog dissipated. The wave of pure, chaotic energy struck Miles Corbin and his followers. The gardener's logic that had overwritten their minds was not designed to handle such a violent system crash. Their connection to the Watcher was severed, and the raw, unprocessed noise of the old world came flooding back in. They collapsed to the ground, screaming, clutching their heads as the messy, painful, terrifying, and beautiful chaos of their own humanity came rushing back. The shockwave threw Marcus backward, his body tumbling down the rocky slope. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his side, and then darkness. Chapter 15. Epilogue: The Echo. He awoke to the smell of rain. He was lying on a carpet of wet pine needles, his body a symphony of pain. He opened his eyes. The sky above was a gentle, familiar gray. The trees were just trees, their branches a chaotic, natural tangle. The world was blessedly, beautifully, wonderfully messy. He had won. He had broken the song. He never knew if he had killed the Watcher or the deep earth intelligence of the gardener. He only knew that he had, for a time, silenced it. The mountain was just a mountain again. The town of Oakhaven was just a town, its inhabitants slowly recovering from a period of mass hysteria, as the official reports would later call it, their memories of the quiet, orderly time already fading like a strange dream. Marcus became a ghost, a local legend. The crazy ranger who had blown up the top of Sutter's Peak and then vanished. He never went back. He couldn't. He knew the bell was broken, not destroyed. He knew that deep in the earth the silence was listening. The gardener was patient. It could wait for the echoes of the hammer to fade. It could wait for the bell to be rung again. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was just right, he would feel a faint, low hum in the fillings of his teeth. A vibration so low it was almost a memory. And he would look to the distant, dark shape of the mountains, and he would know that the garden was still there, dormant but not dead, waiting patiently for a new season and a new, more efficient and more silent spring. The end.